right, we're doing another episode of Film Streak. What do you think? Hey, it's October. We're getting into the Halloween spirit, watching some horror films, and just trying to find something with a different angle, you know? I've watched plenty of horror films over the years, just like all these other genres, but there's still so much out there that I just never got around to. So that's a big part of this podcast. That's going to be exactly what this episode is. And I just want to get right into these because I kind of started watching some of these films and I didn't really have a connection between them, let's say. But then with the last one I just finished watching, literally just a while ago, I said, oh, I think I've got the connection now. And part of it is this idea of using found footage or using the sort of mockumentary style, which doesn't always apply across all of these films, but I think it's kind of a thread, you know, this whole idea of like a story within a story. I think that's something that it's a useful device sometimes, but it can also be a crutch. It can be a gimmick. And so I looked at these films and I said, well, wait a minute, let's see, what are we really talking about here? So the first one I want to get into here is The Visit. This is a film from M. Night Shyamalan, who I heard about many years ago. When did this come out? It might have been like 10 years ago. I think it caught more flack for some of the moments in it than the actual content or even the idea of the story. And watching it now, having like put some time behind me in terms of, you know, what I hear people say about the film and versus what it actually is, I could say that, I mean, some of that criticism or, you know, the roasting of this film, it's not far off, you know? I mean, the idea with the kids, especially the young boy, I'll back up for a second. The film is about two kids, a brother and a sister, and they go to stay with their grandparents while their mom goes on a cruise, a vacation. And the grandparents and the mom, they're sort of estranged. They don't really have a relationship. Some things, it's hinted at, some things happened in the past. They kind of lost their relationship with each other. I think that's a big part of the film is they don't know their grandparents. Like they've never actually met them. And so, you know, I could see that. There's a part of being a child and being kind of at the mercy of adult decisions and the consequences of those decisions. So I get the idea of like, you know, that you're going to go stay there for a while because mom has to go do something or dad has to go do something. You know, it's just a part of how that life has to work. So that kind of gave me an interesting angle of watching this film and seeing how this story is told from the perspective of the kids. It's not told from the perspective of the parent, of the mother, or from the grandparents. It really is the kids, and the whole thing is they're making a little movie, a little documentary about their experience of meeting their grandparents and staying with them. And so part of me thinks, oh, that's kind of cool. That's kind of an interesting way into a story like this. But of course, it's very clear this is a horror movie. So where's the horror going to come in? Because this feels a little more like a domestic drama or maybe even a comedy in some ways. But the twist on the whole thing is that the grandparents, they start acting weird. They start saying weird things. Things don't seem to line up with them actually wanting these kids there or even being grandparents. There are a couple of things that you feel like, well, maybe they're just a little awkward, or maybe they aren't used to having children around or whatever. But there is other stuff that's definitely weird. And this film hinges on this idea that there's an inherent like trust that I guess you have to have in terms of these kids. But that starts to turn and the kids start to see like, nah, this isn't right. We need to probably look at how to get out of here. But of course, that's hard to do as a child in an adult type of home or a situation like that, right? If you've seen the film, you know where this is going. If you haven't seen the film, there is a sort of a reveal. It's not really a twist, I guess. You get the sense pretty early on that something's not right. So you know something else is going to happen. But when it's finally revealed, like, oh, these aren't actually their grandparents, and they wouldn't know that. So they've been trusting that these are the people that they are supposed to be staying with. That's when the film kind of hits a new gear and it becomes something very different. And, I would say, like, if it would have gotten there faster, maybe that would have made this more, I don't know, thrilling to watch. Because I feel like that's where, whether you're a child or a parent or a grandparent, like, if you're somewhere in that equation, you know that there are things that are very kind of scary. They just are parents and children's worst nightmares of the people you trust or the people you love aren't the people you think they are. And what happens if they go sideways and suddenly things become dangerous? So that's a big part of the film, but it really doesn't come into play until like the last, 30 minutes or so. Up until then, it really is more about these kids and figuring out, who they are and what they're trying to get out of this trip. The kid, little white dude, wants to be a rapper, is pretty cringy. I mean, it's hard to kind of take that seriously. And I'm guessing that's even on purpose. Like, I don't think he's intentionally supposed to be actually good. I think the idea is like, this is a kid who's delusional in a way. But let him have his dream. Let him rock with that for a minute. But otherwise, I mean, the film has a pretty interesting concept. There's something about the way of holding this real turn in the film until so late. I feel like that's something that M. Night Shyamalan has done in different films to different degrees, right? You have something like The Sixth Sense where the whole turn in that film, the kind of twist ending, is at the very end. And then you have something like Old, which is more recent, where it's pretty clear up front, like really early in the film, like something's not right here. It's not clear what exactly is wrong, but the characters, it doesn't take long for us to figure out something else is going on. So I don't know. I really wouldn't put this too high up on the, let's say, the M. Night Shyamalan rankings. This is probably down towards the bottom somewhere. I mean, there are certainly harder films to get through than this. It has a couple of interesting moments, but it does use the found footage sort of mechanism pretty well most of the time. There are some moments where I think you can feel it's like a cheat. Like the camera, like whoever is holding this camera should have put this camera down in this moment. But for the sake of the film, for the sake of telling the story, camera keeps rolling. Someone is still holding this camera in a situation where they definitely should have like forgotten all about this. So that's where I feel like a lot of times this kind of thing breaks. The whole conceit of found footage. You've got to justify why somebody would still be holding a camera when all this is going on. And so I think it gets a little shaky, especially towards the end. At the beginning, it kind of makes sense, and it shows the kids' real commitment to doing this as their like project type thing. But I don't know. For a found footage film, I feel like I've probably even seen better too. So the next film I want to talk about here, it doesn't go that way, right? It doesn't use the found footage thing, but instead it kind of works on the premise of a show within a show or a story within a story. And that is a recent film, actually. It's called I Saw the TV Glow. And this is a film that it doesn't seem really like it's a horror film. I think it's kind of put in that category. But as I was watching it, this is just a film about a bunch of sad kids. I want to say that's really like a modern day kind of contemporary subject. Because I just don't feel like these kids would have been able to cut it like 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Even though this show is set in the 90s, these two high school students It's was it like Maddie and Owen? I think that's their names. It's a guy, it's a girl, and they're friends, but they kind of bond and they share this fascination with this kids' TV show called The Pink Opaque. But I think the thing to keep in mind here is that this isn't so much of a horror film, other than the fact that it really tries to draw on these sort of strange, I don't know, the distortion that you can have when it comes to nostalgia and when it comes to almost like the obsession with a thing or a TV show in this case, right? So part of the film is about these two characters and them sharing this love of this TV show, but then it is also about them kind of going their own ways. And especially, we really follow Owen in this. In the older version of Owen's played by Justice Smith, who I feel like I've seen him in some things I really like what he's doing. In this film and in a couple of other things I've seen, I feel like he just brings like no energy to it. And I think that's not him. I think that's this film, maybe even the filmmaker here is looking for a specific tone, because it does really kind of feel very somber and very kind of morose. And, even the editing, the pace of it, it just kind of drags like the whole time. And it's not to say like there aren't some good ideas here, but I just feel like the I don't know, the tempo of it, it kind of gets lost in itself. And when you have this character who, I kind of get the idea of like, okay, he's hung up on this. He's hung up on this moment in time, this moment in his life, and his friend, and this show that they, kind of shared together, and his sort of disenfranchisement with people his age, people around him. He's kind of become an outsider. And there's something that I'm sure everybody in any generation can relate to in that kind of thing. But this film, I think it really hangs on it so hard that there's a point where we follow these characters, we follow Owen particularly, like well into the future, well into his life. I mean, I think we go 20 years down the road, which makes sense because at first I wondered, like, why is Justice Smith playing this high school character? The dude is like 30 years old. But when we get to see him later in his life, we can keep the same actor. Okay, it makes sense. Got it. But even then, it's like, well, he's still hung up on the same thing. And it's not until a real kind of late stage part of the film where his character does have that moment of kind of breaking it, kind of seeing reality again. And maybe it's the way it's played in the film, it's almost like he would rather have the previous version of what he imagined life would be versus where he ends up. He's like working at like a Chuck E. Cheese type joint or whatever. And there's some ground to work with there in terms of an adult maybe being stuck in the past, being stuck in their childhood, whether it's good things or bad things that they've hung on to, and they can't really seem to move past them. And then one day they wake up and they realize, oh, my life has just gone to waste, or I wish my life were different, or whatever. Those are all relevant things and interesting subjects to explore. I think this film, it kind of tries to walk a line of like being very visually interesting and stimulating and different, and have these characters really be kind of non-conventional types, I guess. I mean, I don't know. They just seem like I said, like the sad kids in the bunch. And they talk in a way that I don't really feel like teenagers talk. And I don't feel like teenagers in the 90s talked. I mean, having been a teenager in the 90s, I know that there are people who were, they didn't really call them the emo kids or whatever back then, but there were those groups of young people that had a hard time dealing with things, or maybe felt like they were on the outside of things. I get it. And yet here, though, I mean, it just feels like a very modern sensibility applied to something that happened in a different time. And it doesn't fit. And maybe it's because I was there. So there's something about this that just doesn't really kind of add up in the end. And you add to that, like, this actually isn't very much of a horror film in terms of it doesn't have moments of like terror or gore or violence or anything really. It really is just about this character, these two characters dealing with their emotions. And it's not to say that isn't something to be addressed, but it's not typically what you get in a horror movie. So I would say like this, I'm interested in this filmmaker. I want to know more about what else this filmmaker is going to do, because I do feel like this has a very different kind of visual style. I think the subject matter kind of dictates that this has to move slower and be more pensive, but maybe with some other type of subject matter, some other themes, this sort of approach to filmmaking, to telling a story, using this sort of like retro VHS degraded video style. And it's only in parts of the film, but that stuff seems to hold true. It's the stuff that's set like in the real world that it feels just like it feels like it's kind of halfway there. So I'm interested to see what else this filmmaker, and by the way, this is writer and director Jane Schoenbrunn. I hope I pronounced that right. But I'm interested to see what else Jane will be doing, because I think this is a really interesting style. I'd just rather see it applied to maybe some different subject matter. The next film here, this is a film that I've been wanting to see for a long time, had it on my list forever. And I finally thought, oh, well, this might actually fit here. This is where I was like, oh, maybe I see a pattern. The Taking of Deborah Logan. And this is a film from, when was this? It was about 10 years ago, too. It's an interesting sort of found footage / mockumentary, documentary type of film that, I kind of thought, all right, I feel like we've seen something like this, where we've got the found footage thing, where we've got the people who are looking into some weird incident, and turns out, oh, it's a possession, right? Someone is possessed by a demon or whatever. This film, it actually does something really interesting in that it doesn't lead on to that at all. I mean, if you look at the cover art, that clearly tells you what you're in for. But if you were to watch this don't watch the trailer, don't look at the cover art, just look up the title and watch it, you could really think that you were in for a documentary about someone who is, or rather, a film about a film crew making a documentary about somebody who is dealing with Alzheimer's. And someone who's in their elder years, even though the actress that plays Deborah Logan doesn't seem entirely that old, but that's the premise here, is that this is a woman who is going through some illness. She's experiencing these sort of like dementia or Alzheimer's like conditions. So the introduction to the character, to her daughter, her adult daughter, and just the situation of her life, it feels like, okay, well, this seems like a real interesting approach to telling a story about a woman who's dealing with illness, and how this can be, how this can be terrifying. Because, look, if you've ever had to deal with somebody who has either Alzheimer's or just like a neurological disorder or disease, it is honestly, legitimately frightening. And it's not frightening in the sense of like there could be like violent moments, there could be, stressful moments, but it's more about the fear of losing a person who is basically standing right in front of you, of watching a person lose themselves. That's a very real thing. And it's hard to put into words, maybe, but the sense of it, the feeling of it, of knowing, and especially in this film, it's depicted as this woman who hires this film crew, or no, actually, it's like a kind of a trade. Like she's going to get money because the film crew is there under like a grant or something. And the premise is they're going to document the mother and explain and show what this is like living with this. And so, on that alone, if that's all the film was, I would be interested, because that is it's a very personal kind of subject matter to me. But also it is in its own right. It's terrifying and it's frustrating and it's hard to understand. It's confusing. And so this film does a lot of that. It sets a lot of this character up and it sets a lot of this situation up where you could kind of explain away these weird things that are happening to someone dealing with a neurological disease and being elderly and possibly dealing with emotional issues related to her past or her daughter, or, all the things that really do come into play. This film has it. Now, this film takes things to another level because it is a horror film. And so it starts to reveal that this woman isn't just dealing with a neurological disease, isn't just struggling with Alzheimer's. There's actually some really dark, weird, deep, hidden thing that she's locked into the back of her mind for a lifetime. And now it's coming out. And it has to do with like a local serial killer. It has to do with a conspiracy. It has to do with her neighbor and murder and all of these things. And so you think, okay, well, wow, all right, that's a lot to throw into the mix. But then the film goes even further to show us like it's not just a serial killer. It's not just hiding these crimes. It's not just like locking that away in a closet somewhere in the back of your mind. There is also some kind of demonic force thing running all of this. And that's where the film really kind of goes to 11. And, I got to say, even the feel of the film, from when it starts, it feels pretty banal. It feels straightforward. Like you're seeing what's there, and you get a couple of hints of like, well, that's too bad. That's unfortunate. This is someone's life or whatever. And it slowly builds to, the last part of the film really, where it's just all hell is breaking loose, and the whole town is involved, and the hospital staff and the doctors and the neighbors and the police. It becomes this wide-ranging thing. And it's nothing you see coming, really. I mean, the way the film starts, it's like this is going to be a little small, contained thing. Might even just happen in this house. Very much like The Exorcist, right? It's about this one character and her struggle and the people that try to help her or, fix this situation. Well, it just balloons out the whole time into much bigger things. And, I got to say, like, it does a pretty good job in the beginning by keeping it pretty much up and up by taking a real kind of clinical approach to talking about Alzheimer's, talking about the struggle of just living a life with that and having to deal with physicians and tests and all these sorts of and medications and the conditions that it puts you in mentally and physically. And so that's where I think the film does a pretty interesting job of just taking you down the wrong road just long enough so you're in. And then when it starts to turn the screw and we start to see oh, no, there's really some weird things going on. It pulls it off, I think, pretty well. It does get a little bit cheaty, sort of like The Visit, because it is all found footage. Again, this film It uses the found footage approach with all of the documentary crew and their footage. We see security cameras. We see, like, when they go to a hospital, we see the footage from the hospital security cameras. So there are a couple moments towards the end of the film where things really start to go crazy. And whether it's something like walking around in a house with a camera with one light on it, but no lights on in the house. Like, who does that? If you're walking around in a house, turn lights on. That's easy enough. Of course, that doesn't make it as interesting cinematically, but it kind of breaks the whole illusion of, like, this is supposed to be like a real thing that's happening. Because, hey, reach for the light switch. That's all you got to do. Once you get out into the woods, and there's other moments where we're outside of the house and other things are happening, well, then it becomes the opposite issue of, like, hey, man, put the camera down. You got other bigger things to deal with here. Possibly a woman who has gone crazy, like roaming the countryside. Go find her, put the camera down. There is an interesting thing that happens in the film where this film crew, we've got our, I guess our host or director, is a young woman there. And we've got the two other, one's a cameraman, and I think one is maybe like an editor or something like that. Well, one of the guys is like, you know what? This is getting weird. I'm out of here. This lady is doing some crazy things. She's like jumping on counters. She's walking in the middle of the night, making weird noises. I got to go. And for that moment, I just thought, yeah, exactly. Do that. This is too much now. This is more than I think anybody bargained for, right? So at least the film addresses that much. It's like, not everybody's going to stick around for this. Not everybody's got it in them. Sorry. But otherwise, I mean, I thought this was pretty interesting. You know, I don't know that I would necessarily say it was scary in terms of the horror aspects of it. You know, the quote unquote traditional, conventional horror tropes that it works with. But I think the idea of showing us this situation of a woman dealing with illness and being, you know, later in her years, like, that is a real thing. And trying to draw the metaphor between being scared of someone being, like, I don't know, possessed or hiding a secret, compare that to someone who is not going crazy, but who is losing themselves to a disease. I think that's not a far leap. It certainly looks very similar from the outside. You know, someone who is around a person like that, it can feel like your mother, father, your grandfather, grandparent, whatever, is going crazy, is possessed. That's not the case, of course, but it can feel that way. And this film, I think it draws close enough of a thread to say, like, those fears that you have, that confusion that you have, it's real, and there are ways to work through it, but you shouldn't confuse it. I mean, there is a moment in this film where the daughter goes to a priest and says, you got to help me here. This got to be something you can do. You know, the thing, right? You do the thing. They don't really say it outright, I think. But, you know, she basically kind of like talks around it of, like, she needs the dude to come do exorcism on mama and get that sorted out. But the priest, of course, taking a more realistic approach, is like, I mean, that's a thing that has been talked about, but that doesn't really happen. We don't really do that, you know? And look, I mean, whether you believe those kinds of things actually happen or it's just stuff of movies, it's at least taking an approach of, like, okay, that's a road we could go down. We're not going to go down that road. There's some other way we're going to handle this. And so I kind of like that. I appreciate that on the behalf of the filmmakers, of trying to maybe lead us down a road we know, but then saying, nope, that's not it. We're doing something else. Just keep watching. So I applaud it, you know. I like it. And so, look, the last film I want to talk about, it's Late Night with the Devil. This is a film that it's pretty recent, 2023, and it's got a really interesting take on not only just the found footage aspect, but also the kind of show within a show thing, you know? And it does a pretty good job at the beginning of really sticking to that bit, of really trying to stay on track with how to tell this story this way. The film is presented as it begins as kind of an unseen telecast, right, of an old talk show. And we get the sense through like little subtle things, because we are seeing like what the TV cameras see. And then we jump a little bit behind the scenes with some like alternate angles or whatever. But we're getting the sense like there's something going on with the host. Like, I don't know. He's on bad times. The show, the ratings of the show that he's hosting, not doing so great. And so we're catching up with this fictional TV show on its Halloween episode. It's already kind of got a tinge of like, oh, this is going to be like spooky or do something clever maybe. Because if you're talking about TV shows, I think, I don't know, maybe young people today don't really know what those are. But, if you're a certain age, like all the Johnny Carsons and the David Lettermans, and even way back before then. But then you even have the newer, the Jimmys and the Stevens and the whoever's, right? So it's a format. It's a format that is well established. And we kind of know the rhythms of it. We know the setup. And this film uses all of those things. But then we start to see like one of the guests comes in and is really kind of abrasive and really obnoxious. And then we see another guest come in and they've kind of got some strange things going on. And you kind of feel like, well, is it a little bit of like, oh, this is the bit. Let's stick to the bit. It's part of the show. But then it gets really weird. And then it gets really scary for the audience, for the host, for everybody involved. Because now it's like, no, there's some other bigger thing at play here. And I think for the most part, it kind of works. This film also, this is why I say like this mostly works until you get a film where it starts to deviate and it starts to say, okay, well, we can't kind of keep this whole thing running of watching the footage as it was recorded, because at some point, maybe the camera's turned off. So how do we still show what's going on? How do we keep the thing going? And this film kind of does that. It does break from that at some point. And now we're just watching a film now. We're not watching the show within the film. And so I think it's a really interesting effort. I think that they really commit to the era and the feel, whether it's like the wardrobe or like the sets of this TV show, even the like grainy kind of old telecast style, the visual style, right? It's not quite like VHS or video, but it is that old like 60s, 70s era television. And so I commend it for that, for giving it an honest try. But I think there's a point where the film kind of breaks itself, breaks its own rules. And for the sake of telling the story, that I feel like, well, maybe you should have just found a way to keep it contained to itself. You know what I'm saying? So you didn't have to go and break your own rules. So I don't know. Some of these films I think are interesting in the way they approach this, with this found footage or film within a film, story within a story type of approach. But it just reminds me like this is actually kind of hard to do. Even some of the films that I think are kind of known for this and probably do it better, but whether it's something like the Blair Witch Project or something like Cloverfield or one of the first ones, one of the earliest ones, which I think is considered like a horror cult underground classic or whatever, but like Cannibal Holocaust, it is a found footage film inside of a film. So it works it enough to where it makes sense and it doesn't fall apart. But it's not often. A lot of people have tried it. Some people have been able to make it work. Chronicle, that's another one, right? Isn't that a found footage film? And I just talked about, in the last episode, I talked about Apollo 18, which is also a found footage film, like in space, like on a lunar mission. And for the most part, I feel like that committed to the bit pretty solidly. So It's tricky. It's a hard thing to pull off. And I think it depends on your story. Like if your story tells the audience like this has to keep happening, but somehow the cameras, the device you're using to tell the story shouldn't by any reason be working anymore or be a part of it, how do you do it? Well, sometimes you have to cheat it. Sometimes you just say, well, forget the found footage thing. We're just going with a regular, presentation of a film. Any found footage favorites that you have? I mean, it's cool if they're horror films. They don't have to be that, but it's always curious to me how a filmmaker decides, like, that's how I'm going to do this. And when you get into a corner, like, how do you still stick with it? So that's interesting, though. These are some new films I saw. I've got some interesting episodes coming up. I hope these will be fun. I hope these are at least interesting entries into the horror genre. And we'll talk about some more coming up soon. So look, until then, go to filmstreak.com. You can find other episodes. You can subscribe. You can sign up to get these by email if that's easier for you, if you don't do like Apple or Spotify or whatever. I also have a list on IMDb of all these films, so you can go there and add these to your list. You can see where they're playing. It's just a useful thing. It's for me, of course. I try to keep track of everything I'm watching. We're well over 500 films now, pretty soon, I think. So we're going to keep it going. I still got like 1,500 films in my watch list. Maybe the goal is around the 2,000 mark. I don't know. But until then, hey, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. So thanks for stopping by. And until then, go watch something new.